Lying is not a crime. If you lie to your wife about an affair you're having, society may view this as morally reprehensible, but this is not a criminal offense. However, things change once money is involved. If you publish false information about a stock and cause it to trade at an artificially inflated or deflated price, this could be securities fraud, which is a felony. Think of a pump and dump scheme where someone buys shares of a penny stock and publishes false information to induce unsuspecting investors to buy the stock. This causes the stock to trade at an artificially inflated level, allowing the pumper to then dump his shares for a profit. For decades, courts have grappled with the difficult question of where to draw the line between lying and fraud. Recently, a federal court in Texas gave a shocking decision which appears to make it far more difficult to convict people for pump and dumping. In December of 2022, the Department of Justice indicted 8 social media influencers on charges of securities fraud, alleging that they profited to the tune of $114 million between 2020 and 2022 via pump and dump schemes. The case revolved around a podcast called Pennies Going In Raw, which was co-hosted by 2 of the co-defendants. The case immediately garnered significant media attention. The defendants were easy to dislike. They flaunted their wealth, including by posting pictures of sports cars. According to the government, at least one of the defendants referred to their activities as, quote, robbing effing idiots of their money, unquote. The government alleged the defendants lied to their followers by publishing fake information about penny stocks and encouraging their followers to buy said penny stocks at the same time they were dumping their shares. The government had access to the trading histories of the defendants' brokerage accounts, numerous public statements made by the defendants on social media, as well as private communications between the defendants discussing their pump and dump schemes. To the surprise of many legal analysts, a federal judge dropped all charges against 7 of the defendants in March of 2024. Even if all the prosecutor's factual allegations are true, the judge ruled that the alleged activity would not constitute securities fraud. This was a shocking decision, which on its face seems to legalize pump and dumps. In this video, we'll take a deep dive into the facts of this case, and what the recent ruling means for securities regulation going forward. The prosecution's case centered around the podcast and YouTube channel called Pennies Going In Raw, which we will hereafter refer to as PGIR. PGIR was co-hosted by Daniel Knight and Mitchell Hennessy, who went by the name Hugh Hennessy. There were 6 other co-defendants who would from time to time show up on the PGIR podcast. The defendants portrayed themselves as stock market experts and regularly recommended penny stocks for their viewers to buy. In addition to the podcast, the defendants maintained a public Discord server where they would give penny stock recommendations. Finally, the defendants all had Twitter accounts, with some of them having hundreds of thousands of followers. The defendants gained credibility among their followers by bragging about the millions of dollars they've made in the stock market. They backed up these claims with expensive sports cars. According to the government, the defendants' main motivation in their social media activities was to convince their tens, if not hundreds of thousands of social media followers to buy the penny stocks they promoted. On their social media profiles, the defendants often gave disclaimers that their posts are not recommendations to enter a stock, and their followers should not trade based on social media. These disclaimers appear to have been little more than lip service. In other communications, the defendants frequently encouraged their followers to buy stocks based on their recommendations. The nature of the defendants' stock recommendations were relatively unsophisticated. Most of their analysis consisted of drawing lines on charts and saying a stock will go up. Despite the low IQ nature of their analysis, the defendants' social media activities in many cases resulted in significant, albeit temporary, increases in share price. The defendants often targeted microcap companies with low liquidity. It's important to remember that this activity was happening between 2020 and 2022, which was the height of the COVID-induced stock market bubble. Millions of novice investors were entering the market for the first time. With the defendants claiming to be highly profitable traders, many novice investors were eager to follow their advice. On many occasions, the defendants told their followers that they do not engage in pump and dumps. When they recommended their followers to buy a given stock, it was because they were buying the stock themselves. According to the government, this was often not true. The defendants would buy shares of the penny stocks before making the public recommendations. As soon as the stock price starts to increase, they would dump their shares without informing their followers. For example, one of the defendants, Gary Deal, said he thought a penny stock called CEI would increase to $1 and he intends to swing this stock. Swing is a slang term meaning holding a stock for more than 1 day. Within 2 minutes of posting this tweet, Deal started dumping his shares for an average price of 48 cents. He presumably set a high price target and long duration to prevent his followers from selling before him. The government alleges that this is securities fraud because Deal misled his followers about his intentions with the stock. Most of the alleged misrepresentations relate to the defendants' price targets and intended holding periods of the stocks they recommended. However, there were also cases in which defendants made false statements about the penny stock companies themselves. One of the most brazen examples happened in February of 2021 when defendants Daniel Knight and Mitchell Hennessy appeared on the PGIM podcast. Hennessy promoted a microcap stock called Torchlight Energy Resources, which at the time was planning to merge with another penny stock called Meta Materials. Here we'll listen to a short clip of Mr. Hennessy promoting the stock.
One of the backlashes of TRCH is that they're only getting 25% of the company. And this is the way that I like to look at it. They're getting 25% of a company that could be potentially worth, let's call it, even if they got 1%. Okay, let's say that they're valued at, let's call it that Meta and TRCH together when they merge is valued at $5 billion, because that's the amount of assets as of September 2020 that they had on the books. So if we take them just at that value and TRCH has 25%, okay, TRCH, even if their market cap is underneath $1 billion, is still undervalued. Okay, so if that didn't make sense, again, the market cap is what the company is worth, based on the shares. So TRCH's market cap as of right now is 400 million. Okay, so now if Meta, when they merge with Meta, can reach a market cap of 5 billion, that would mean that TRCH's piece of that, so the 25% of that piece, would be worth around, was that like 1.25? So again, if we're going to value Meta at based on their assets, so let's call it, and that's not how that works, but let's just do it that way. Okay. Let's value them at their assets, which is 5 billion as of September 2020. TRCH gets 25% of that. Okay. That means that on book, TRCH is worth at least $1.2 billion. As I just said, the market cap of TRCH currently is 400 million. So that means that we could potentially see 3x from here just based on valuation. Now we can go crazy and, start saying stuff like, the PE ratio, and then it just gets stupid. We could see like 10x from here.
Sounds pretty good. As of September of 2020, Meta Materials had book value of $5 billion. After the merger with Torchlight, shareholders will own 25% of Meta Materials. By Mr. Hennessy's math, this will yield a value of $1.25 billion, or 3 times greater than the current market cap. Therefore, a $10 price target is doable. In fact, this is conservative, because if you value the company on price to earnings, the stock could increase by tenfold. The problem is, none of this was true. At the time, Meta Materials was already listed on the Canadian Securities Exchange, and their financial statements were easily accessible. As of September 30th, 2020, Meta Materials has assets of 13.8 million Canadian dollars. They had book value of negative 4.7 million Canadian dollars. The $5 billion of book value Mr. Hennessy referenced appears to have existed only in his imagination. In the most recent quarter, Meta Materials generated 263,000 Canadian dollars of revenue and had a net loss of 3.9 million Canadian dollars. His statements about valuing Meta Materials with a price-to-earnings multiple were absurd. According to the SEC, Mr. Hennessy dumped his position in Torchlight Energy within days of the podcast, yielding profits of $288,000. He sold his shares before the merger happened and far below his publicly stated price target of $10. At least some of the defendants appeared to have very low opinions of their followers. In a private Discord chat that was unintentionally recorded, defendant Daniel Knight allegedly referred to his social media followers as effing idiots who they were robbing. In a separate accidentally recorded Discord call, Daniel Knight discussed with some of his co-defendants why he posted fewer recommendations on Twitter than they did. Knight said that he posted less on Twitter to reduce his chances of criminal liability. By this point, Mr. Knight appears to have been getting nervous about what he and his co-defendants were doing. He believed they were committing market manipulation and could end up in jail. Perhaps the reason for Mr. Knight's anxiety was because their enterprise grew far larger than he probably expected. The government alleges that between 2020 and 2022, the 8 co-defendants generated $114 million of trading profits as a result of their pump-and-dump schemes. The government was able to access trading records from the defendants' brokerage accounts and match these to a timeline of the defendants' public statements. As far as what trades were made and when, there really isn't any doubt. While some of the defendants may contest some of the government's factual allegations, this is largely irrelevant, because a federal judge ruled that even if the defendants did everything the government alleged, they would still not be guilty of securities fraud, at least not based on the legal theories used in the indictment. On its face, this is pretty shocking. If lying to the public to artificially inflate penny stocks and then dumping your shares isn't securities fraud, then what is? Securities and commodities fraud is defined as knowingly executing or attempting to execute a scheme or artifice to defraud any person in connection with a commodity, option, or security. The controversy arises from the scheme to defraud. What exactly is a scheme to defraud? A scheme to defraud requires the perpetrator to intentionally deprive another party out of money or property. For example, if you're selling a horse and you tell the buyer it's 10 years old when it's actually 30 years old, this would be a scheme to defraud. The buyer is willing to pay you a higher price thinking the horse is younger than it actually is. You defrauded him out of his money because he received a product different from what you told him. The buyer was clearly harmed because he received an inferior product. For fraud to occur, it's not enough just to deceive the victim. The perpetrator also needs to intend to deprive the victim of property or money. In 1987, the government tried to prosecute a company called Star, which provided bulk mail service in exchange for a fixed price. Star deceived its customers about how much it paid for postage, and thus how much profit it was making. Presumably, Star believed it would be difficult to market to customers if they knew that Star was making excessive profit margins. The court ultimately ruled that Star was not guilty of fraud. While they indeed deceived their customers and may have received a financial benefit for this, the services they provided to their customers were exactly as advertised. Because the customers received exactly what they expected, they were not deprived of money or property. The Star decision and similar decisions make it more difficult for the government to prosecute fraud cases. It is no longer sufficient to show that the perpetrator deceived the victim with the intention of making money. The prosecution also needs to show that the perpetrator made the victim suffer a loss. In the years after the Star decision, prosecutors developed a new theory called right to control. This theory holds that if someone withholds important economic information from a victim, which is necessary for making decisions about their assets, the victim's right to control their property has been violated. The right to control is considered a form of property. Therefore, if a victim's right to control their assets is infringed, they have been deprived of their property. Importantly, under this theory, the prosecution does not need to prove that the victim suffered a monetary loss. This is a bit abstract, so let's look at an example where this theory was used to secure a conviction. In 2017, an executive at the multinational banking giant HSBC was convicted of wire fraud. The incident happened in 2011 when Mark Johnson served as global head of foreign exchange for the bank. A company called Cairn Energy had $3.5 billion which it needed to convert to British pounds. Cairn called up a number of banks trying to find out which one can give them the best exchange rate. One of the banks they called was HSBC. Mark Johnson assured Cairn that HSBC could discreetly acquire British pounds without driving up the price, unlike competitors who would front-run their clients at a worse rate. Believing Johnson's pitch, Cairn hired HSBC. But behind the scenes, Johnson instructed his traders to buy British pounds ahead of the client, inflating the price and netting HSBC $7 million of profits. Following the transaction, Cairn's finance team was suspicious. They saw the pound appreciated slightly right before the transaction, giving them a worse rate. When they asked Mark Johnson about this, he erroneously blamed the unfavorable exchange rate fluctuation on the dollar-selling activities of the Russian central bank. He concealed the fact that he told his traders to buy pounds ahead of the transaction. Despite Mr. Johnson's deception, HSBC did not violate the written agreement it had with Cairn. The contract did not specify the trading method the bank was to use, and explicitly stated that HSBC was not a fiduciary or advisor to Cairn. It would be difficult to prove that Cairn suffered a material loss. The front-running activity likely caused Cairn to get a worse price than they otherwise would have. However, it would be very difficult to estimate the exact terms Cairn would have gotten if it used a different bank. Even if a different bank would not have front-run, they may have charged other fees, and Cairn may have received an even worse rate. Cairn agreed to the terms of the contract, and the contract was not violated. Before knowing of the front-running, Cairn was happy with the exchange rate it received. It was very difficult to prove that Cairn suffered a monetary loss, so the government instead relied on the right to control theory. The prosecution argued that Johnson withheld important economic information, and therefore deprived Cairn of its right to control its money. Unaware of Johnson's plans to front-run the transaction, Cairn was not able to make an informed decision and was thus defrauded. In 2017, Johnson was convicted of wire fraud and sentenced to 2 years in prison. If we look at the government's allegations against the 8 social media influencers, it's somewhat similar to the case against Mark Johnson. Just like in the HSBC case, the government made no attempt to quantify the monetary damages of the purported victims. They instead focused on the defendant's misleading statements and material omissions. The defendant's social media followers were denied economically relevant information, specifically the information that the defendants intended to dump their shares. Thus, the followers were unable to make informed trading decisions and their right to control was infringed. This is conceptually at least somewhat similar to Mark Johnson failing to inform Karen about his intentions to front-run the foreign exchange order. Despite the apparent similarities between the two cases, the outcomes were very different. Mark Johnson was sentenced to 2 years in prison, while the charges against the social media influencers were dropped. So why the disparity? The 8 social media influencers were indicted in December of 2022. At this time, right to control was still considered a valid legal theory. While prosecutors had successfully been using the right to control theory for over a decade, the Supreme Court had not yet commented on this issue up until that point. In 2018, Louis Chiminelli, the owner of a construction company in Buffalo, New York, was convicted of wire fraud. He perpetrated a bid rigging scheme, which gave him an unfair advantage in his $750 million government construction contract. Prosecutors relied on the right to control theory in the trial. After numerous appeals, the case eventually worked its way up to the Supreme Court, which reversed the conviction in May of 2023. The Supreme Court invalidated the right to control theory, saying this strayed too far from the original legislative intent when securities and wire fraud laws were first established. The Chiminelli decision happened subsequent to the indictment of the social media influencers, but before any of them could be tried. Because the indictment implicitly relied on the right to control theory, which had been invalidated, the judge decided to drop the charges. However, this isn't necessarily the end of the story. The judge dismissed the case without prejudice. This means the government is free to re-indict the defendants related to the same alleged conduct. In his ruling, the judge made it clear that he did not condone the defendants' alleged conduct. He said that, if true, it demonstrates a lack of veracity, candor, and character, as well as an overwhelming propensity for putting their own well-being ahead of their followers, regardless of the consequences. But in light of the recent Chiminelli decision, the alleged conduct is not necessarily illegal, at least not as charged. In the indictment, the prosecution focused almost entirely on the defendants withholding information regarding their trading intentions. At the time, this prosecution strategy made sense. Right to control was accepted legal theory. The burden of proof was relatively low because the prosecution did not need to prove that the victim suffered monetary damages. The Department of Justice may relitigate the case using more traditional theories of fraud. For example, if they can prove that a defendant's false public statements caused the penny stocks to trade for inflated values, this may be enough to establish monetary harm for the victims, who purchased the shares at these inflated prices. This may be enough to satisfy the narrow definition of fraud established by the Chiminelli decision. Regardless of the eventual legal outcomes of the 8 social media influencers, there is no doubt that many of their followers suffered significant financial losses by following their recommendations. Their apparent legal victory may embolden other would-be pump-and-dumpers to engage in similar schemes. In light of the regulatory uncertainty, it's more important than ever to be careful whenever you see anyone on social media recommending which stocks to buy, especially if said stocks have small market capitalizations. Whenever you see anyone recommending any investment on social media, it's usually best to assume the worst. Trust nobody and independently verify everything before making any investment decision. Alright guys, that wraps it up for this video. What do you think about the social media pump and dump case? Was the judge right to drop the charges? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, thank you so much for watching and we'll see you in the next one. Wall Street Millennial, signing out.